All right, if you came here, then that means you are pretty much well aware now that I've said it a couple times, right? You're here for the controller class. So you're over here to just essentially learn the basics of controller and some things that you can take with you in more advanced games. Okay, I'm going to be giving you everything from understanding why smokes exist the way they do, reading it, okay, reading things like understanding the difference between, you know, fake smokes, understanding the more advanced techniques of like when you would push up a smoke, okay, all that type of stuff. But of course, in order for us to get there, we need to understand the very bare bone basics. Okay, so right now we're going to be learning about the purpose of the smoke, understanding which characters can and cannot smokes. You know, how vital are they? Is the controller class really that necessary? And then things like differences between the orb smokes and the wall smokes, which will make sense later. And then understanding those characters a little bit more in depth with advanced techniques and tips that you guys can use for later. Any questions before I start?
Not from me.
Not from you. Anybody else? We're good? Awesome. Okay. So let's understand the purpose of the smoke. When you guys are looking at the map, every single space right here, okay, is completely open. And what I need you guys to know is that there are two different forms of holding an area. Okay. It can be a very passive way of holding an angle. It could be a very passive way to just kind of hold the area on its own, or it can be a more active area. Okay. When you're holding the area, okay, we need to kind of understand what exactly your team is doing to keep that little zone, that map control. Okay. So as a good example, we have this space right here at the beginning on A. This is ascent. We're starting here on A. And what's happening is when you have someone like KJ, well, KJ can be inside of the site. They can be waiting. They can be pushing for it. You know, they can be waiting for a push. This is them actively holding this space, right? When you do something like maybe instead they put like a turret here or maybe something like here, I don't know. Just put your imagination on where the turret might be and they're playing off of it. This is a more passive way of holding the space, okay? Understanding the different ways in which you can control space is what's going to make a difference in how you use your smokes. So a good example of this might be a jet is basically holding an angle here with the op. What you're going to notice is this space that she's holding right here is completely hers because she has an op. Okay. She is holding it down. This is the space that she now controls. Okay. And when you're using this type of space, when you're using maybe when you're using something like an op to hold an angle, okay, this is what now is something that you have to retake away from the enemy. The best way to do that is by controlling sightlines with initiators by using flashes or using smokes. Okay. So now that we understand a little bit about how space works, okay, we're going to see how we can use smokes to kind of manipulate that space a little bit more. So yet again, we're going to be putting in our example of jet right here. Since the sightline is a more active way of holding this space, we have to make sure that we're putting in a lot more pressure from the jet. Okay. So something like a smoke, for example, let's just use an example here from Omen. Okay. We can use this smoke right here to essentially cut off that line of sight. So what we've done right now is we've interrupted this piece of control that they have. Okay. Of course, we can also use that to pressure them. So let's say, for example, they're holding this space right here with the op. We can put a smoke right behind them, right? This is basically what creates pressure. Okay, so you have two ways of kind of pressuring. You either contest by removing it altogether, or you can remove it away from them by putting a lot of pressure. Let me move on to the next bit here. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about how you can use those smokes to kind of push them in or out, let's understand how smokes work a little bit more in depth in the game. When we're watching someone like Omen here, and I'm just going to give myself everything just so you guys can see. One of the things that Omen can do, or any other character for that matter, when they smoke, is they close up these spaces. And what you need to understand is that the smoke obviously can be shot through, right? You can walk into the smoke. You can essentially do other things like flash out and then work into the smoke. But the problem is, like we talked about that line of sight, you have no vision on that area. So the way that you have to interpret smokes is not this thing that you can shoot through and then you can work yourself through. Instead, it has to be thought of as this wall. Okay. When you think of it as a line of sight that is broken, the enemy team has no way to kind of work around it, right? Basically, anything that happens behind this wall right here is completely unbeknownst to them. So anything that goes through the smoke is new to them. This is why teamwork, like getting information, why using flashes, all of that really comes in handy when fighting this wall right here. But how do we create these walls, these effective walls? How can we use them to sort of like break these lines of sight? How can we use them to make sure that when someone is holding this space, we can essentially make sure that they are at the most disadvantageous position possible? Okay. And for that reason, we need to talk a little bit about the characters that can and cannot smoke. Okay. Controllers are the class that basically have most of the smokes available to them, but they're not the only ones that have smokes. Okay. Characters like Jet, characters like Cypher, characters like, to some degree, maybe potentially Phoenix. They all have some form of wall that can cut some sort of line of sight. Characters like Omen, characters like Astra, characters like Viper. These are characters that have also been designed to create those lines, like breaking those line of sights, making sure that you can create really disadvantageous points for the enemy. Like both of these have very similar traits. However, these guys are going to shine right on top when it comes to creating that space. So now that we understand line of sight can be broken with smokes, understanding like these choke points can be broken up by walls of smoke, right? We can maybe delve a little bit deeper into understanding that these characters are becoming a little bit more vital in our game. Do I have any questions so far? Anything that I need to break up? Anything that I need to kind of like come back to? Nope. Okay, perfect. I guess everyone's understanding so far. Okay. With these characters right here that we've kind of now put together, we can kind of understand that when we're using these characters to create these lines of sight, to create these different spaces, right? When we're using controllers, I have it right here. Okay. I need you guys to understand that when we're using controllers, we need to understand the differences between the types of controllers that exist. And there's two types. Okay. There's orb smokes. As you saw right there, something like Omen is an orb smoke. Okay. It essentially works pretty well by just creating an orb, right? That blocks off a line of sight. The second one is a wall. So wall smoke. Okay, characters like Cypher, for example, if you see the little angle in which it works right here, it's an example of an orb smoke in a way. Okay, characters like Phoenix have a wall smoke. Okay, and they can be used to essentially cut up the map a little bit. Okay. When we're looking into these two types of characters, we can kind of understand our playstyle a little bit more closely. Generally, when we're using orb smokes, we can use them in a way where we're a little bit more dynamic in the way that we break up the map. So when you're picking a character that has more control, like these two, with the orb smokes, okay, you can essentially use them a little bit more dynamically to create different spaces of the map and slowly work your way through space. Characters like wall smokes are a little bit less dynamic. So a good example of this is how Viper works. Once you throw her smoke, she's done. Right? Just a random smoke I threw. Now you can bring something like an example of Harbor. Where is Harbor? But one thing you're going to notice is when we use High Tide or his little MS Paint tool, right? The way that he cuts up the map, right? you're going to notice that there's very few things that you can kind of do with that wall as opposed with smokes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those techniques that these characters bring. Now that we've seen I should mention these two these two right here have kind of shown an example of being very unique in the way that they work. Oh my God, am I stuttering? I am. Okay, I apologize. I think something's happening with my recording. Well, maybe not. Where was I? Right. So I was basically saying, okay, so we have orb and wall smokes, right? Oh my God, I might have skipped something. Okay. Okay, this is what I was missing. Sorry, my bad, guys. Okay. When we have orb and wall smokes, one thing that you guys need to understand about each individual position in the controller class is that they're all unique. When you're using an orb controller and when you're using a wall controller, they can do the same things technically. However, each map has their own individual controller character that tends to fit best for that map. Generally, maps like Ascent over here, you can notice that it's a little bit more open in the way that you can cut up these choke points and you can control these pieces of space. Characters like Orb Smokes over here tend to be a lot more successful because of that dynamic nature that they exist in. However, characters like these Wall Smokes are a little less dynamic because of the way that, as I mentioned just earlier, they can only do one space at a time. Orb Smokes tend to have something that we tend to call being a little bit more universal, in which a position like this little middle area right here allows a controller player to be able to smoke all across the map. Both in attack and on defense, this is generally seen as a positive trait, because what happens is most of the time, if you tend to be very one-dimensional in the way that you're playing, a controller player needs to be able to not only chop up the map for the players to be able to control that space, but they need to also be doing it in a way that it's not predictable for the enemy team. So for example, if everybody was just pushing down here and you were just putting your walls down or your smokes down, then they're going to know you're going to be hitting B, right? In cases of maybe putting this Viper wall down the middle, right? They're going to know that you're going to be hitting B. However, in more advanced forms of play, we're going to start getting into positions where you can't just put down the wall here when you're hitting A, right? You need to pick one or the other. And it's that form of dynamic nature between the orb and the wall that tends to be a lot more beneficial for these characters. So now that we talked a little bit about the uniqueness of the characters, let's come back to these characters that I mentioned that can smoke. Okay, Cypher, Jet, Phoenix, all of these have that form of orb and wall that kind of fits them, but they're not really controller players. Okay, they're not really characters that you can rely on to control pieces of the map. The biggest things that will tell you why these characters are a lot more vital is the amount of space that they can take away from the enemy. Okay, if you were to just bring Cypher, Jet, and Phoenix for wall purposes, right, smoke purposes, you're going to be missing on a lot of control, not only on the other side of the map, but you're also going to be missing on a lot of things like the durability of the smokes. Jet smokes last about half as long as Omen smokes, which I think are I think Astra, one of these two. They have about this same duration, but they're way longer than that of these smokes. Okay. So then it comes down to the question, why smoke? What's the whole purpose of these smokes? What's the whole point of these things? Okay. Now that we understand, what the characters can and cannot do, now that we understand about sight lines and how the smoke technically works, what is the whole point of it, right? On attack and on defense, there's two different ways that we can understand these smokes. On attack, the point is to coordinate a push in which you are limiting the amount of sight lines that the enemy team might have into attacking you. So for example, let's say your entire team is pushing down B. And what you're going to notice from this B push, right, is that if you put down both of your smokes that are close in common choke points in which the enemy can kind of look, right, what's going to happen is when they're kind of holding this little area right here, well, it becomes down to the person that is either on site or the people that are on site and the people that are outside of site to make some sort of decision. Okay. Do they push through the smoke? Like I mentioned, it's a wall. They don't know what's going on behind it. Or or stay behind and they just wait? Or do the people inside, do they stay here and they fight, or do they retreat because of the pressure, right? The coordination of the smoke tends to be more on how exactly you're trying to develop your team, your push, and how you're trying to protect your team from any incoming fire. On defense, it's kind of on the same line. It's very similar. It's on the same vein in which you're basically trying to cut off the same choke points so they can't really shoot your team, right? But then the question starts being asked, what smokes work best for your team? And, depending on the side, which one should I use? So for example, I talked a lot about these choke points, and I've been mentioning choke point here, choke point there. A choke point is just simply a good position in which your team is able to completely choke them out, aka choke point, and is able to essentially funnel them into a small area. We're going to use green over here for this example. What you're going to notice is that there's a lot of choke points directly related into the map. But the best way for you to think about choke points, or rather strong choke points, are those that are really close into sight. If you look at any of these lines that I have right here on the site Valoplant, you're going to notice that they all have one thing in particular, and that is they are right next to a very important point of interest. Okay? This is where defender smokes tend to end the most. On attack, there's really no line where you can really direct that line of sight, but the best way for you to think about it is that when you're using this space and you're trying to think about what areas you want to fight for, it is best that you think about what sightlines you're trying to prevent and what exactly it is that you're trying to take away from the team. So now I'm going to kind of like break that down into a little bit more chunk sized pieces so you guys can have an easier time understanding. Okay. So let's say on attack, I want to be able to take this space right here first. Okay. This is the space that I want to take. What you can do is you can break it down into even bigger pieces if this makes it easier, right? If you want, you can understand it in terms of like maybe this, right? In whichever way you want to take mid. The best way for you to think about mid is what sightlines does the enemy have on my team if I want to take mid? And this is where you start looking at those choke points. You have this choke point right here and this choke point right here. So your smokes would go into these two areas simply because you want to make sure that you're preventing the enemy team from attacking your players. Let's say, for example, I want to play for this area right here. Well, one thing that you might try to do is you notice that this is the one choke point that the enemy team is going to try to fight for. So you can smoke that, right? These are very common examples of what you can do with smokes. Same thing on defense. I want to hold down this particular area right here. So the thing that I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to close off this choke point because this is the closest one to it. What you might also notice is that there's also this line right here, right? So you can also close off that point. Both of these are going to be smokes you're going to be looking at, right? These are possible smokes if the enemy team is coming from here. You got to make sure that you're paying attention to what space you have and you don't have. Do I have any questions in regards to picking the right area for smokes? So far, all I've talked about is just simply understanding these choke points. Okay. You want to make sure that you're choking them down, understanding what space it is that you want, and then just kind of closing off any areas where the enemy team might fight for that space. Any questions on that?
No.
None? Okay, perfect. Seems as everyone is having an easy time. Okay. Let's see. There we go. I should use a different color here just so I can differentiate. Defense is the easiest to pick which one to use as a controller. So we're just going to break it down. In order for you to be able to be a good controller, you need to realize what areas you do have. Okay. In order to be a good controller, you also got to make sure that you're not blocking off areas that your team does control. Because what that does is that, let's say, for example, there's someone here that's your teammate and you're over here. If you use a smoke right in this area, you're now blocking off a connection between you and your teammate. So what I'm going to ask you guys is, where would be the best position for you to use a smoke? Let's say the enemy team is coming down orange. Do you think this position would be a good place to use a smoke? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay, let's put a smoke right there. Do you think this position would also be a good position for a smoke? Again,
No.
there are two areas where the enemy might shoot you, but they're all coming down orange. Would this be a good position for a smoke?
No.
No. What about over here? Would this be a good position for a smoke?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because that could be... Oh wait, you said that they're all in main.
Yep, they're all in main. They're all in orange.
Oh, never mind then.
There's no reason to. What about this extra one over here? Would that be a good smoke to use?
No.
No. Perfect. So now that we've kind of used our little bit of information that we had, we can make a good decision on the smokes. What about point like this? And they're all, you know, they're mid, and you know that they could be coming down A main as well. Well, we've already talked about how this is a good smoke. What about these other 3 points? When would you use this one right here?
You wouldn't.
Because they're not inside? Well, what's the reason for it?
Your teammate is still in there, no?
Exactly. You do not want to disrupt the team. Obviously, in context, you would say, well, I don't know if they're there or not, but most of the time you start with this line right here. Okay, so you wouldn't use this one right here. Okay, perfect. Would you use a smoke right there?
No.
Okay, this one, oopsie.
No.
This one right here.
No.
Why is that?
Because there's like a little corner, and if you like move the smoke over to the next one, yeah, you
That
can
would
just
be
take
better,
that
yeah.
space.
Yeah, both of these, I would say, in my opinion, are both equally good. What you need to make sure is you coordinate ahead of time. Because what's happening is, if you use a smoke like this, it's really good because what's happening is you can basically hold them off as they're about to kind of come in, and you can have someone kind of play in this area. However, sometimes you can have someone hold this space, or sometimes you don't want to give them the space, so you might potentially get ahead of the line and then just put a smoke right there. If you put a smoke right here, you're not completely in the wrong, but this is a good smoke. I agree.
I think in
If you-
solo queue, the first one's better, just because you don't have that much time to talk to
Coordination?
your teammates. Yeah.
That makes sense. I
I
completely
feel
agree.
like they would have a bunch more room to peek you then if you put it in the box. That
If you put it
there.
here,
Yeah, they have a bunch more room to move around.
remember, when we look at it, it's essentially they're looking at this. They need to use information. They need to use utility to get out. Now, of course, you're right. You actually do give them a lot more to work with, and I do agree. This is a way better smoke. But in a rush scenario, I wouldn't blame you for using this. Okay? Especially if, let's say, for example, you have no idea they're taking space, and then someone that's sitting right there tells you, oh, they're over in cat. Would you still use this smoke right here? Probably not. They're probably going to be taking that space. Okay? But that's good. We're talking about the smokes. I'm glad that you guys are kind of using this time to look at the potential. Okay? Let's change it over to attack. Now, the one thing that I do kind of fear is that you guys have talked about, I've talked to you guys about like understanding that you're essentially trying to coordinate a push, right? And without question, I essentially talked about how this is a good area for a smoke and this is a good area for a smoke, right? I talked about how these two are pretty good because it blocks off line of sight. Technically, under my definition, you wouldn't be wrong to put a smoke here or a smoke here because that's also a big area for the enemy team to work with, right? So this is where it changes for attack. Okay, the only difference that you have to understand for attack is that not only are you trying to make sure that you're trying to control that little space that I talked about, but you're also trying to make sure that it is a lot more difficult for the enemy team to try to take that space. So for that reason, when the enemy team is trying to take space, let's say for example, sorry, not the enemy team. When we're trying to take a space like this, right? This is the area that we're trying to prevent the enemy team from entering, right? So even though this is technically an area where they can push in, we have that space, right? We don't have to worry about it. Whereas this is an area where the enemy can come in from. This is an area where the enemy team can come in from. In an area like B, I find that some of the players have a hard time conceptualizing where exactly it is that they want to break down the lines of sight. So when you're using this, you need to think of it in terms of sites, right? This is one area. This is another area, right? I wouldn't even blame you if you did something like this, right? Whatever works for you, but you need to conceptualize the form of sight. You need to use this area to control mid. You can even think of this as its own box, right? In order for you to be able to be a good controller, you need to be able to make mistakes. Okay, it's a gut feeling. Maybe this isn't the area you're aware of working with. Maybe this is what you're aware of. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you're better blocking off this, right? Maybe you're trying to block off this, right? And then this, because these are the 2 points that the enemy can come in from. Fine by me. As long as you have a definition on what exactly it is that your team and yourself is trying to take, you're going to have an easier time conceptualizing what the smokes that you want to make. Okay. So since we broke down the whole idea of lines of sight, now we need to understand that on attack, we do not know where the enemy might be coming from. They might be coming from here. They might be coming from here. They might be coming from here, here, etc. You need to make a decision on what point is going to be the most difficult for the enemy to enter from and what's going to do the most damage to the enemy. Do you think that a smoke like this is the equivalent of a smoke like this? Yes or no?
No.
Do these
No.
both block off the same? And why is that? Why is that these two do not do the same? Think about it in the bigger concept of the map. The enemy team could be all the way over here, whereas who knows how many are back there, right?
That one watches flank and market.
What's that, sorry?
That one watches market, which also watches flank.
This one right here?
Yeah.
Flank? Like this?
Like, yeah, they could be like going around and stuff.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But the way that I want you to think about it is simply when you're choosing the smoke that you're trying to pick, right? What I want you to do is I want you to think of which one is going to disrupt the team more. So if you were to block off these two entrances, right? Surely this smoke right here will block the enemy team from like hitting this area. But then what happens to everybody else that's moving in? They have a free line of sight on you, right? And your team. If you block this one off, then anyone that's coming in, they're blocked off, right? Also think about it in terms of that square that I talked about. Are you trying to control this? Or are you trying to control the bigger rectangle, right? This is the decision that you have to make. So using that same criteria, we want to control all of this. Are these two good smokes?
Yes.
One of them
Yeah.
is.
One of them is. So this one or this one? Left or right?
The right one is.
Right.
Okay. What about the left one? What's wrong with this one?
It's in the
It's
site.
situational.
Yeah, situational. I would say that. Would this be a better
Rather-
position? Also a choke like I talked about. So this technically is a good smoke, no?
Mm-hmm.
It's also in the
Mhm.
site, so I don't think it'd be a good smoke.
Exactly. Right?
You better put it where their spawn is.
So you would think something like CT over here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, I do not want to do that. Okay. Same idea. Let's say I want to take all of this. And that should be a little bit more specific. I want to take all of this. We have 1 choke, 2 chokes, 3 chokes, 4, and, well, we don't need that one. Oh, and 5 chokes. Okay, we have 5 different chokes with 5 different smokes. Your team wants to take all of this. Okay, that means their intention is to push in here. Their intention is to push in here. Their intention is to push in here. Okay, we set the stage. This is what they want to do. Now, I don't know why they want to do this, but this is what they want to do. As a controller, you need to be able to identify this and you need to be able to work off of it. Because they want to take all this space in here, right? They want to go through here. They want to do all that. Let's think about the smokes that you might be able to give them. Do you think this is a good smoke?
No.
Probably not. Again, in the context of this, I know that a lot of you are fighting your instincts that why would you want to go through this? You can just put that smoke right there and cross over, maybe jump through. Again, they want to take this space, right? Would this be a better smoke?
Yeah.
Okay, because they want to take this, right? They want to kind of segment this area. Oh, I should have mentioned. I also want to mention these two. Okay. Would this be a good smoke?
No.
No.
Would this be a better smoke?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're trying to block off the outsides of the map, right? Because technically this is a good smoke. This is a good smoke, right? Again, we're trying to work with the definition of what we're trying to take. Okay. Now let's make it a little bit more specific. Most of the time, you guys will never get a team that's this coordinated to do this. Okay. Most of the time you can work as fast as possible and you need to take as little space before you can get sight. Very commonly, you see this space being taken, like so. So let's say again, your team wants to come in and this is the space that they're comfortable taking. So that means they're going to be going like this. Is this a good smoke still?
No.
Why is that?
Because they're not
Because
going
you
to
don't
go
need
that
to
way.
take that space.
Yeah, they're not trying to take that space. So is this a good smoke?
No.
It'd be better.
It'd probably be better. I wouldn't deny that. But remember, you're still fighting all this, so I'd be careful. What about this smoke right here?
Yay.
Yes.
Probably better, right? Notice how you're basically controlling the space. What about this smoke up here? Good or no?
No.
No.
What about this smoke?
You're-
Yes.
Yeah, because it controls this space right here. So what I've now just shown is understanding the smokes is segmenting the area, understanding what your team is willing to work with and what they're not going to work with. Okay. As you get higher in the ladder, as you play more ranked, you'll notice what your teams are very comfortable playing right off the bat. On round 1, for example, let's say they're going to go through mid and your brain is thinking they want to control this. And you wouldn't be wrong to think that, right? So what you do is you decide to send out 2 smokes right here, right? And now your team can control this space. But then you encounter the first problem. Uh-oh, they didn't tell you where they really wanted to go. So now you're stuck in this green square, right? After that, you start thinking, okay, well, their intention was actually to push towards B. So what you do is you kind of reshape the way that little square works. Instead, you change it like something like this, right? And what you do is you change it from this smoke right here and this smoke right here to potentially this smoke right here. This is why at the beginning of the round, talking about what you're going to do matters. So what I've shown just now, it's a simple take mid, right? Control mid to potentially B, right? What would need to happen if I said mid to A? Where would this smoke go? Would it go here still? Would you put it down there? Would you close off this choke? What would you do?
I would put it like on the blue line.
The blue
Yeah.
line right here?
Mm-hmm.
Oopsie. And what about, because again, we're going mid to A, right? And let's say your team wants to control all of this, at least. Okay. You would put this smoke right there. And why is that?
I don't know. I just remember from the TikTok video we made, it was a good smoke.
Ah, that's a different thing. And that is for a different day. Okay. This one right here is if you're basically defaulting. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about a different one. Okay. So let's say your team wanted to get up to this point like we did before. Right? But instead of saying they want to go mid to B, they're going to go mid to A. And they still want to control all of this. Would this smoke still stay here, or would you move it down to any of these locations? Does this seem like a decent idea to you?
No.
I think the blue line's still fine.
The blue line over here?
Yeah.
This one over here?
The team's kind of reaching for the back, but getting pizza.
Yeah, because they're trying to take this space, right?
I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, good. I'm just going to discuss a little bit as to why that's the case, because I know Munch is a little bit higher up. So basically what I've done is I basically shown you guys a potential for your team to essentially try to go into spawn, right? This is actually one of the main common misconceptions. Just because you can route your team into like very dangerous areas, it is your job to essentially leash your team into areas where they're not going to be in trouble. So a good example of this might be, you notice that your team wants to play for this space right here and they want to smoke right there. Now, in most common scenarios, you would just give them what they want, let them see, let them try it out. But if you notice that it's not working, they're just putting the team at risk for a play like this, right? So smoke like right here would not really make sense. You would just want to make sure that you can protect the team as much as possible. So what I've done right here is I basically shown you guys a very basic mid to B push where you guys are just pushing in through market, right? If they wanted to do something like switching from mid to A, it is no longer this smoke that you want, right? You want to make sure that this space is no longer kind of like there. It is no longer like really good. They still want this space, right? But they're putting the team at risk for something that's going to be open for later down the line. Because what's going to happen is if you put the smoke right there and you're trying to go to A, you cannot put the smoke right there. Because as we talked about, you're essentially creating a line that disconnects the team from what they want. Similarly to what we had here. They're trying to control A, and maybe over here by tree, you've now disconnected them. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what's the smokes that would be good here. You can do this one right here. You can do this one right here. But again, because they want to take that space, this mid smoke is fine. Okay. What about this one? Where would you put the second smoke? Any ideas?
Wait,
I'm going to
where are we going
put
again?
A, B, C, D, I don't know, E, maybe F, I don't know. Give me a letter. What do you guys think would be the best smoke in this scenario?
B.
Why B?
Because I don't know, it just makes like a direct pathway into A.
Okay. Any other takes?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, we have someone agreeing. Anyone want to play devil's advocate and pick a different one? Just to be contrarian, maybe?
Like we are going mid to A, right?
Yes.
Are we having everyone go mid?
No, B is the best option, to be honest.
Okay, we have a lot of people taking B.
Devil's advocate would
Okay,
be.
do C.
You could do D.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
D? Okay. D
Or
would
G.
work. D could
Let's
work.
say you have a Cypher or Jet pushing up Cat with you guys. They could smoke off B instead. And then the whole team shoots out a C together.
Okay, now we've talked about a little bit of cooperating smokes. We have things like this guy being brought into the conversation. Yeah, that would work, assuming we have that plan. Both of these are equally good. Okay, but it does require this idea in mind. As a controller, you would have to, of course, make that choice. Do you have someone helping you or not? This is why we talked about those extra smokes. Okay. They can help you cut off this line. If you do not think they're going to help you cut off this line, then you're better off giving that B smoke for your team, right? Because in this scenario, they can still fight. They still have to cross. But in every other scenario, I'm pretty sure your team would try to help you out. Okay. So we've talked a little bit of attack. We've talked a little bit of defense. We've talked about understanding how these smokes work. Now let's talk about how you can properly smoke. And then we can kind of close it off with some small tips that I can give you guys. This right here is my attempt at showing you what a choke is. Okay? This is the inside of where you're going to be fighting. This is the outside. So a good example is, for example, this. This is the inside of where you're fighting. This is the outside of where you're fighting. Okay? Most people will tell you that you want to make sure that you're putting your smoke in a particular way. And this is for a reason. Let's work on the negatives first. Sorry, let's talk about the positives first. When you're using a smoke, you're going to notice that I've placed them in such a way they're essentially flush with the wall. If we go over here and we showcase our smokes with Omen, no, maybe not. If not our smokes with Omen, you're going to notice that I've placed them in such a way that they're essentially flush with the wall. The positives of putting it flush with the wall has two benefits. Number one, when someone's pushing out of a smoke, they essentially have no areas of cover to work with. And the second one is, when you're putting a smoke flush, they don't really have any areas down here that they can kind of like sneak their way through. Of course, this is a bad example because of course they have this little area that they can work with. But if we were to use anything else, for example, they don't really have anything to kind of like use as cover to where to kind of go in, right? So let's talk about the two negative forms of the smoke. So let's talk about the first one. One that is a little bit pushed back. I'm going to talk about the one over here. This one's the easiest. I'm going to talk about. So this is your flush smoke. As I mentioned, it is basically really good at essentially preventing the enemy team from coming in. They have no cover. Okay? The first mistake that I see a lot of players do is, first of all, they don't actually pay attention to whether they're actually closing off the choke. Make sure that you're actually closing off the choke. Make sure that you're putting a lot of time into making sure that the choke is being held just a little bit. If you need to do it like this, I know that if it's rushed, as long as you do it, it's fine. But as you're getting better, you got to make sure that you understand the possible combinations of a bad smoke. The first one is it's too pushed out. Pushed out a smoke like this can essentially give the enemy team something to work with. As you can tell from what I'm doing right here, right? I can essentially use the little area you've given me, if you use this bad smoke, to be able to use the chokes as cover, which would give me plenty of time to essentially get a teammate to kind of flash out for me or swing with me, giving me plenty of time to essentially take a couple fights before I actually get a chance to push out into sight. The second smoke, it's too pushed in. What you're going to notice about this one is that the smoke now gives me extra cover. As you can tell with the flush smoke, I needed to step directly outside, and the second that I touch sight, I'm exposed. However, a smoke like this, it gives me a little bit more to work with. So when I'm trying to step out, I get all of this space to work with. This is why when you see Jet players tend to play, they tend to just kind of throw a smoke a little bit outside. So it may look like they're going to go this way, maybe this way, right? They're just trying to confuse you on where they're trying to exit. Do not give them that extra space when you're learning controller. Okay? Make sure that when you're using your smokes, you're trying your best. Make sure you're looking at the mini-map if possible, that you're trying to control as much space as you can while giving them nothing. Okay? This is what's going to lead you to better smokes and a better idea of how to control the enemy. Do I have any questions on pushed out smokes, inside smokes, all that type of stuff?
Wait, so Nano. So when you're doing a pushed out smoke, like if the enemy team has like a blind agent, Yoru or Phoenix, so don't you think it's better pushed out, because when they're flashing, the people who are holding cross like close a door, and yeah, that position, like they don't get flashed and they are able to like fight.
So let's say they have a smoke over here that's pushed a little bit back. Maybe it's not. Oh, it's flushed. My bad, guys.
Yeah, so like
Uh,
when they like when Phoenix like curves his flash, I don't have the reflex, so I just get full blinded. Okay.
mhm.
So sometimes when I play smokes, if there's like a Yoru or any person, so I just try to do like a deep smoke if they're rushing in.
Oh, I see. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, so basically what's happening is this is the situation. Smoke's a little bit pushed back. And what's going to happen is if anyone uses any utility when pushing out, it might potentially not hit anyone that's holding an angle like this one and done that I'm holding right here. And that's not bad, right? But you got to think about it like this. You are not the only person that flash targets, right? Remember how I talked about a little bit of space? It is targeting everything in this vicinity, not just you.
Yeah.
So what happens is that flash essentially allows the player to not only step out, but get comfortable with the space that they're working with. Sure, I mean, they have to take maybe a 50-50 when they're taking the fight with you, or maybe they'll double swing you, but this doesn't give you the best chances to fight. Okay? Now, there is a way to counter that type of play style. Okay? And it's actually the complete opposite of what you're thinking. This is actually, you're kind of stepping a little bit ahead of what I was going to go for, but I'll kind of explain it now. One of the advanced techniques that a lot of players have picked up, especially in pro play, you're going to notice that they're not using a flush smoke. They're actually pushing it a little bit farther out. Okay? Because what's happening is when they're pushing out, if they go this way, they can't really clear one corner, right? They have to choose one or the other. The way teams, especially pro players, have been fighting for that is if you are playing for an aggressive push, make sure that you have someone with you. Because what you can do is you can create a really pushed out smoke, maybe like something like this, and you're essentially forcing the enemy team to make a decision. Do they fight you, or do they fight the other person that's holding this angle, right? And you're going to notice this really... It's a really popular thing that they tend to do, especially on Ascent for this angle. Because as you're going to notice, it gives me plenty of time to kind of react to any push, right? On both sides, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
The only way you can really counter that with a smoke, if you feel like they're pushing out for you, make sure you're paying attention to how you're controlling that distance and how you're controlling that space. A flush smoke is still going to be good regardless. But if you have a play with your teammate, you can create this space right here. Okay. Do I have any other questions on this smoke, or maybe like the pushed out, pushed in, flush smoke that we just talked about? So after this, I'm going to step into like good techniques to know, and then we're just going to close out the class. Any questions? None. Okay,
Nope.
Perfect. Okay. So the first technique that you guys need to know is, like I mentioned, every smoke is unique. So not every single smoke will be able to do this. Omen is perhaps the most flexible out of the bunch, but by no means is he the only one able to do all of these things. The first thing we're going to talk about is a very popular thing called a one-way. Okay? Who's heard of a one-way before? You guys aware of a one-way? Maybe you guys have used it before. Maybe you've seen it before. So the way that a one-way works is, as its name kind of states, it's basically created so one of the ways in which they're holding the angle has an advantage. What you're going to notice from this particular example of a one-way, there's no way for you to be able to fight back properly until you get away from the one-way. Okay? It is a really powerful tool for both attackers and defenders to use when they're trying to prevent the enemy team from essentially fighting back. Right? So what you can do is you can use these one-ways as an example of taking an advantage in any fight that you might be able to that you might be taking. Okay, not all characters can do one-ways. but there's some scenarios where the one-way is possible. Okay, so for example, in this ledge right here, most of the characters that drop a smoke up here, excuse me, can throw a smoke into this area. Now, I should specify that this is mainly an orb smoke thing. Okay, you can't just use a wall and create a one-way with a wall. Honestly, that would be too overpowered, but I would like to see it one day. So when you're looking at one-ways, make sure you're looking at orb smokes. Secondly, when you're using, when you're making sure that you're doing a one-way, especially with a character like Omen, make sure you're paying attention to the green arrow. You're going to notice that it turns red occasionally and green. Green means that it's going to fall down perfectly and you'll be okay. Make sure the green arrow is on the ledge and you'll be fine. Characters like Astra, characters like Brimstone, okay, make sure that either their little aura is on top of here, right, like you would with Brimstone, or make sure that the star is on top of here so you can do that smoke properly. Like I mentioned, they're really good ways of being able to prevent the enemy team from creating any sort of potential moves on the space that you're trying to hold. What you're going to notice here is, of course, I can't do a one-way on everything, right? If I do it on something that's like red over here, it would be a great one-way, but of course, it kind of falls through. So that's the first technique that you guys need to know. Second technique is splitting, okay? Splitting sites, splitting space. Since we talked a little bit about the way that controllers tend to work, okay, what I've done just now is split this space, so this space is now mine, okay? Typical controller stuff. When your team is being pushed, when your team is essentially being attacked or any of the sort, what you can do is you can create little openings in the enemy and the enemy's push. So what you can do is, for example, do something that we like to call splitting site. There's multiple ways of splitting site, but most of the way that players tend to split site is by using either the front of the site and the back of the site. What I've shown just now is an example of a smoke that tends to split site from the front to the back. And the way that teams tend to play around this is either they can play inside of the smoke, waiting for the enemy team, maybe get aggressive. They can play on the left side of it, being able to return all the way to the back, or they can play right here and then maybe use one of these two potential angles to leave, right? It also gives them a chance to kind of work with the space that they have. Because of course, as they're pushing out, this smoke can only do so much, right? So if you notice that they're still coming in and they need help and they can't get out, you can give them a smoke to kind of work around. Okay. Another example. I'm going to say that this one is pretty strange, but I've seen it work. Okay. This works for characters that have really good mobility. So characters that have, for example, teleports. Okay. In CS, they would call this basically a caterpillar smoke. As you can see, it kind of creates like a little bit of a caterpillar. If you continue making orbs, it would create a little bit of a line, right? And what this does is it creates basically a straight line between you and the enemy. The way that they tend to use this space is, instead of creating that same caterpillar smoke, they instead create 2 points of contact. And what they do is, if they're having a really hard time, for example, creating space with what they got over here, like the very basic stuff, right? They can use this right here to make it basically an outplay. So this is really popular with Omen characters, where they tend to just kind of fake their TPs. Characters like Jet, where they might create like a bunch of different smokes over here, and then they might dash through, right? Make it a lot more difficult for them. They might create, you know, something like this, right? Where the 2 smokes will be placed down for your team, but then the enemy, then your Jet, for example, might throw 2 smokes down for your team to kind of walk through. So the caterpillar smoke or the extended caterpillar can be both examples of ways that you can use to kind of break the enemy's line of sight. Okay. And then the last one, this one's more Omen specific. You're going to notice that a bunch of them are Omen specific just based on how diverse this kit is. The last one is an elevator smoke. Elevator smokes tend to work in many different ways. Okay. There's a couple ones that I've seen. So for example, they tend to use it like this, where they start up on the sky, and as it comes down, they use it as a way to kind of fall with it. Another example of an elevator smoke that I've seen, as you guys saw, I can't really create a one-way, but what they do is they started up high, so when it's time to peek, they have a little bit of a one-way when they're trying to push out. This is really useful for people that want to create a small one-way before they peek and try to get an early fight. Okay? That one's a little bit more advanced. Okay? Let's talk about one final tip that I need you guys to understand. So I talked about this early example with Jet. Jet is essentially holding this angle right here. Jet is essentially trying to control this space. As we've talked about, this is very active, a very active form of space making, right? If the enemy can use the smoke right here to break this space and reclaim the area that they're fighting for, right? You can also do this, but it can make your team lose space. Okay? It is very popular amongst the metal ranks, especially in silver and in gold, where players will see that someone is in trouble or they think that they can help them out, and they throw a smoke really, really early. So let me go back to Valorant to show an example of that. Let's say your teammate is holding this line of sight right here, and you're playing somewhere here or here, and your team tells you, hey, they're pushing out on A. And what you first do is, instinctually, you want to block off this choke. Okay? What have you done just now to the person holding this angle? What have you done from this point to this point? What were they doing right now? They were holding an angle.
They were holding an angle.
Yeah, fuck them.
That's one way of thinking about it.
They were risking getting one shot, tapped on the head.
I mean, they were, but what I need you guys to think about is if they were
it's just
holding
losing
this angle.
space.
What's that, sorry?
You're losing space.
Exactly, yeah. You're losing space. Okay? Nothing is more frustrating than having someone hold an angle and they're ready to take a fight. And what you do is you basically block that off. They didn't even have a chance to fight. You just block that angle for them. Now that they can't take this fight, you've lost all of this space. Remember, I've talked about active space and I've talked about that passive space. If someone is holding that line, that means they're actively holding that space. So if you're holding this space and out of nowhere, your controller just drops the smoke right there, you've kind of just lost all of the control you had there in the beginning, right? They essentially broke this line of sight and you no longer control this space. Anything that happens there, you don't know, right? So make sure that you're paying attention to what your team is holding. The best way is to look at the mini-map. Usually they have a little portrait. You can see what they're looking at. If you see that they're holding this space, maybe just hold on the smoke, right? I know that a lot of players tend to panic and they immediately send that smoke. Just be aware of that.
You could also ask for a one-way, or ask them if they want a one-way.
You can also ask for that. In this scenario, yeah, you would ask for a one-way. Okay. With that out of the way, we're basically concluding class. Okay. We're concluding class here. Do I have any questions on anything that I've talked about?
Nope.
Nope. No questions?
Nope.
Okay, then it must have been a great class. You guys learned a lot. Okay, just to recap. Okay, make sure you're paying attention to what space your team is controlling. And then with that idea, make sure you're kind of paying attention to what chokes you're picking. All right?
Okay.
Whether you're attacking on our defense, make sure you're trying to look at what smoke you're going to be using. Most of the time, you're going to be using a flush smoke. That smoke that essentially closes off this space. But if you choose to go with something that's different, make sure you're communicating that with your team.
Yippee.
I've kind of talked a little bit about the tips. I mean, that's something that you guys can review on the VOD. Any last few questions? Again, nothing? I'm about to close it off. Okay, I'm going to close it off here.